you, Lucia, for that generous introduction. Not everyone knows me. She was just generous. So we have got 3 very broad topics today, and to discuss those, I would like to call upon Farid Rahimi, who is a social and political activist here in the UK, and he has been involved in community engagement in the local borough of Brent. We are going to discuss 40 decades of armed conflict in Afghanistan and ethnic tensions. It's not all doom and gloom, there will be some positive stuff as well. Another guest, another important person is Farkhunda Trust, who was involved in Afghanistan for a long time, and she's the human rights and development consultant, and she will talk to us about good practices of diaspora engagement in Afghanistan as well as here in the UK. I think I'll go in the middle, and you can come in here. Also, we've got a video speech from Kabul from Mariam Safi, no relation. She is the director of the Organization for Policy Research and Development, Development Studies, or DROPS as it's known locally. It's committed to strengthening democracy and democratic values in Afghanistan through policy research. But we will start with Farid, who will give us a brief summary of what the 40 years of war has done to Afghanistan and its people. So I'll give him 4 minutes, and then we go to Mariam.
Thanks, Sana, for the introduction. Thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon.
Okay, but we'll come back to him for another 3 minutes, another 4 minutes.
The mechanism is changed.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a privilege to be here, and thanks for everyone to be here. It's an honor for me to talk about diaspora and its role in Afghanistan. So if you could possibly just... The aim of the topic is about diaspora's role, UK's Afghan diaspora's role towards Afghanistan, and it is in the context of girls' education and women empowerment. The research that I conducted between a couple of months from now, however very partly I engaged with this topic due to too much of commitment and travel abroad. The methodology, the research is based on two issues, and that's it's a qualitative method. It's done, yeah. I think the first bit will be yes, okay. So it's a qualitative method. Academic resources conducted all these data collection and data analysis, and followed by empirical evidence collected in the form of interviews in Afghanistan from officials and public in the UK. So I'd like to talk about diaspora first. So very briefly, diaspora is studied from different perspectives, just a brief definition. So the literature is quite complicated and it's led by controversy, so a lot of definitions about it. But one acknowledges dual homeness, and it is also challenged because of this dual homeness. So for example, it used to be a word of Greek origin, dispersal around the world by Cohen and Defoe. And ideal types are forced mobility. For example, Goldreich, defines diaspora as a network of people scattered in the process of voluntary displacement, usually created by violence under the threat of violence or death. So Armenians and the Jews historically could be defined as proper diaspora. And Ruber Zaka, for example, in scholar identity and ethnicity, would define it, talk about the roots and the roots. So the point of departure and arrival, which is important. All these definitions and analysis is based on my research paper. You could easily read that if you get a chance to read it. And ethnicity is also there's a huge link between ethnicity, race, and diaspora. So in its original formulation, it is quite linked with biological notion of descendancy and continuity. The information is, the definition is by Antheus 2001 would provide good information about this if you want to read it. So ethnicity also led to the political potential of diaspora identity as a mode of answer being taken for granted. The notion of citizenship, nation and identity. The point here I'd like to emphasize about Afghanistan and ethnicities, this is very important. So theoretically, some of the writers have defined Afghan ethnicities under an essentialist framework. That means that there are certain characteristics that Afghan people across the world would ascribe themselves to certain specific groups or ethnics. So it is informed by the structure of Afghan society across the world and within Afghanistan, which is also due to the event of war and conflict and violence in Afghanistan. Really changing, yeah. Thank you. Informants, some of the informants that I interviewed, that I will discuss about them in a later stage, they have different perspectives and different ideas about ethnicities within Afghan communities in Afghanistan and beyond, especially in the UK. So ethnicity in general could be a complex identity category which may be further disaggregated according to regional and tribal essentials, explained by Khan 2013. And coming to the issue of conflict and violence in Afghanistan for the past 3 or nearly 4 decades. So obviously, the information everyone knows from the late 1970s up to the incident of 9/11. So everyone knows that there are about 40 years of conflict and violence, and that has resulted to large-scale migration. There are, and this one of the significant issues that I found in this paper is that how this violence and ethnic tensions have resulted to the issue of social relationship about Afghans in Afghanistan and beyond. So people have different ideas, different thoughts about how the social relationship is in the UK and how in Afghanistan. So this is a critical issue that could be further examined by researchers and writers. So I just point out that point for you because of this presentation. With respect to Afghans in the UK, it was an important destination after Germany because of personal networks and UK's labour market, based on some references, and there is no accurate reference for how many Afghans do we have in the UK. But the 2000 census would provide approximately 56,000 Afghans living in the UK, which 45,000 is in London. And no accurate records for Afghans who are involved in higher education. We tried, with the support of Rahela to contact every university in the UK, but it's very difficult to get that accurate information. And finally, as I mentioned before, this conflict, war in Afghanistan has increased the vulnerability of social relationships, which has in return affected diaspora in the UK also. So I would rely more about the issue of interviews and the information that I conducted interviews in Afghanistan and in the UK. I will share with you that after a brief video.
Go to Mariam Safi, who sent her speech from Kabul, and she's going to talk to us about the role of diaspora communities in the peace building process that started not just in 2011, it started even before that. And even after, when the Soviets were in Afghanistan, some small-scale initiatives were taken by Afghans in different host nations to bring Afghan diaspora together and, in a way, contribute to Afghanistan and to this bigger peace process that we are starting to see some results now. So let's hear from Mariam.
From Afghanistan. This is Mariam Safi. I'm the Executive Director of the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies, And I would just like to extend my gratitude to Mrs. Rahela Zadiki and her amazing team for having me as part of the Diaspora and Academic Conference. I wish you all a wonderful day, full of productivity, and I look forward to its outcomes. I will be speaking to you today about the role of diasporans in the peace-building process in Afghanistan. It's a unique topic. It's one that's very close to my heart, and there's always very unique nuances in this role. And in the academic literature, actually, there's very little discourse on the role that diasporans play in conflict or post-conflict countries or peace-building missions. The literature that does exist tends to talk a lot about the positive attributes, and those positive attributes being the capacity, the knowledge, and the expertise that diasporans often can bring from the outside into the country in which the peace-building agenda or state-building agenda is being implemented. Its role in terms of remittances, its role in helping to implement programs in Afghanistan by working along the diplomatic community, the military community, and also INGOs, and their role as lobbying groups in the countries that they reside in, lobbying their policymakers to ensure that interests within Afghanistan are maintained and that support is continued. And so these are, in a nutshell, some of the positive attributes. But when it comes to the negative attributes that diasporans play in peace-building context, there's very little literature on that. To the extent that I have seen it in my 10 years in Afghanistan, I would say that the implementation of large programs in Afghanistan, led by the international community, facilitated by members of the diasporan community who come to Afghanistan for short periods of time to implement these initiatives, is often problematic. It's problematic because their understanding of the context is not as in-depth. Second, I've seen that the predominant number of capacity building programs that the international community has implemented in Afghanistan, though yes, a very large portion have gone to building local capacities, to a certain extent, a lot of that has also gone into building the capacities of the diasporan community. And while there's nothing wrong with that, in 2014, when the international community started to withdraw a significant number of their personnel, both military, political, and humanitarian, we in Afghanistan started noticing that we did not have mid-level local actors to assume responsibility of this mid-level management that now had become vacant. And it had become vacant because when the international community withdrew, so did a large number of the diasporan community that had come earlier on. So since they had received they were leading these initiatives and they had received a large portion of the trainings that were provided for those specific positions, when they had left, there was a huge gap. So you had the top level, and then you had the bottom level, but this mid-level managerial sort of sector became vacant, and we went through a very difficult time trying to find individuals, whether it would be government, whether it would be civil society, whether it was media, or any of the private sector to fill. A third negative aspect of the role of the diaspora community that I have witnessed in Afghanistan has been the participation or the influence, might I say, of the diaspora community in the rise of corruption in the country. There is evidence, but little evidence that I can present to you now that would illustrate how we could measure the rise in corruption with the presence of the diaspora community. But there is quite a tangible connection here that requires further analysis and further evaluation. So in my experiences, those are three of the negative consequences of the role of diaspora in Afghanistan, while the positive attributes have been, in my opinion, particularly the diasporans' involvement in bringing outside expertise and information into the country, which is actually has been in our context in Afghanistan, but has also been quite pivotal in other peace-building contexts around the world. Hence, wherever there is a peace-building mission that commences, you have the development of institutions like the IOM, which do one thing, and that is to ensure that they bring diaspora and expertise back into the country to help this process. And so we're not only a unique case to this endeavor, but every other peace-building context has faced the exact same scenario. And I think a key role that the diasporan community can play outside of Afghanistan is particularly their role in lobbying policymakers to ensure that Afghanistan meets both its interests, that its civil society organizations are supported so that they can continue to fight for the cause and struggle of promoting democracy and human rights and women's rights, especially at this juncture when we're in the middle of a peace process that is threatening all of these core values. And the diaspora community can also ensure that the voices of the people of Afghanistan are heard outside, and that they are represented outside. And if they can act as that vehicle through which these voices can reach policymakers in various parts of the world, particularly countries that play a very important role or a key stakeholder role in Afghanistan, is extremely valuable. And I would say that with regards to our peace process right now, the peace and reconciliation process with the Taliban, it has become even more important for Afghans in Afghanistan and those abroad to be able to combine their efforts. And I've seen a little bit of that already take place with some of the efforts from Washington to London, with initiatives that Mr. Siddiqui has already put forward, and these are right steps in the right direction, and I really would like to see them continue. But there are criticisms in Afghanistan on the role the diasporans play, and this criticism has not only been from Afghans. In fact, the criticism that has emerged against the women's movement in the peace process was that it was Kabul-led, elite-centric, and diasporan influence. When this criticism emerged a couple of months ago, it came from the West, and it was picked up by some local actors here. And then this was played on a lot, and it was played on a lot because the women's movement had gained a tremendous amount of momentum, and to weaken it, the criticism was that subnational voices are not represented, or subnational voices, enough efforts have not been taken to incorporate that women's voices at the subnational level are represented. And though initially this level of criticism, I find, even now, that it is quite unjust, because women's voices at subnational level by women in Afghanistan and women in the diaspora community, both those diasporans working here and those abroad, have been represented. It has been on an ad hoc basis. There hasn't been a systematic mechanism or tool that can ensure that we are able to collect women's voices at the subnational level in the peace process.
Well, thank you very much to Mariam Safi for that very insightful and comprehensive overview of the role of diaspora. And it's a good time to go to Marika. Thanks for being with us. And first of all, your thoughts on what Mariam said, and then if we can go to some of the ways that Afghan diaspora communities can contribute to their host nations, and then by extension to Afghanistan.
Yeah, Thank you. I thought Mariam brought a lot of great points, highlighting both the negative and the positive. And I think what she was saying towards the end about now is really the time for the diaspora to be engaged in a responsible and productive way, both in their host countries and in their home countries, is really pertinent at this time during peace. And even what you were saying, that there are differences across the population in Afghanistan around what constitutes peace, whether it's just the cessation of violence or whether it's a peace that involves a lot more human rights issues. And I think what's also quite helpful is when people think about building coalitions, a lot of it is about sharing information, sharing political analysis, because there's often, let's say, people in Washington would say, in which I am from and I live here now, would say, yes, it's about the end of violence, but then others who work with Congress would say the moment the US withdraws, all the money will dry up too. And also the European Union is unlikely to support a country that does not uphold human rights. So there are always trade-offs to be made, and those discussions need to be had. And I won't go through a lot of what I had prepared because Mariam has already covered it, so I really do want to focus. I'm going to focus less on sort of the diaspora's role in the socioeconomic development of its own country and focus a little bit more on its role in policy development in their host countries. I want to just bring up one fact that was done by a study in the US. A strong lobbying group, we use the term ethnic lobbying. It may not be appropriate in the Afghan context. It should be national Afghan lobbying, is the single most important determinant in bilateral aid allocation and in supporting and in sort of influencing US policy or British policy, European policy in other countries. And there was really a lot of interest in the United States around diaspora engagement, around policy development. And the interest, of course, came from a number of sources. You had the Afghan government very concerned that there was this drying up of aid, so they needed to bring in the skill set and the productive investments of the diaspora. But there was also a small community, actually it's not that small, a quite large community in the US of people like myself, others who worked in Afghanistan at different points in their life, who have fallen in love with the country, but who are all moving on to their next jobs and recognize that they can no longer be advocates for, let's say, Afghanistan's sustainable development, and that there really needed to be Afghan diaspora groups organizing in a collective way, in an effective way, who can then sustain that sort of analysis, but also sustain the lobbying efforts. And there were really a lot of positive examples that you can look at in the United States. So it's I think you mentioned some of them, the Israeli-American lobby, the Greek-American lobby, which I am part of, well, not the lobby, but a Greek diaspora member, the Armenian-American lobby, and they've all been very successful in promoting productive policies. The example, however, that spoke the most interest and seemed most relevant in the Afghan case is actually the Iranian-American groups, especially one group called NIAC, it's the National Iranian-American Council, and it was critical to the establishment of the Iran nuclear deal with the US during the Obama administration. And the reason it's so interesting is that this is despite the fact that Iranian Americans are very divided. They intensely dislike the regime there, and they have never actually mobilized. And we can really learn quite a lot about their efforts to mobilize in the community. One was this focus on, which sometimes I see this in the diaspora community with Afghanistan as well, is that the Iranian American community was too focused on the internal politics of the country and in deciding what they wanted on the internal politics rather than taking a set of principled positions. A set of principled positions that can also align with the values and interests of other potential allies in the host countries. So one would be, whether I know the criticisms that come across it, but one would be women's rights. One could be sort of democratic processes, regional stability. It doesn't necessarily all have to align with the host country's values, but there is definitely more ability to be productive. The second aspect is that a lot of it is determined, and so that's both in terms of, that's both the ability to sort of relate and get maybe a bipartisan consensus in their host country, but also a way of mobilizing around a set of principles rather than thinking about sort of the divisions that you were talking about ethnicity, political, and so forth. Another aspect is the dedication and commitment of individuals. When you look at the internal characteristics of a successful lobby, a lot of people talk about what matters most is community size. And community size does indeed matter, and that's why any efforts to map out the diaspora community for Afghanistan and understand in what districts they live in, then you will understand sort of the leverage that you can have against any host, within any host country. However, one of the things I have noted is that, especially with the Iranian American organization, that really did accomplish a lot with the Iran deal, is that it was actually driven by the dedication of 3 or 4 people. And the dedication of them not to be leaders, but to be able to demonstrate some successes to get on board other community members in a way in which that sort of breaks down some of the power dynamics that often happen when people try to create an organizational infrastructure. Secondly, or thirdly, is, as I said before, is to really understand how do you sort of build strategic or tactical alliances with other interest groups in the host country. So for example, for those, let's say, organizing under the principle of media freedom, something that is often talked about in Afghanistan, since despite the daily attacks on journalists, it has one of the freest media in South Asia. There are a number of groups across the world that care about the protection of journalists and so forth. I also think it's really important to think through how does the diaspora community build coalitions with Afghans internally? Because a lot of the discussions I had before were with actually more rural sort of youth networks in eastern Afghanistan, and there was a real desire for them to get the diaspora engaged. But what I wanted to emphasize here, they didn't think they needed capacity building. They didn't think that, they actually hold the knowledge, more so than the diaspora. What they needed was communications and connectivity. Communications meaning access to policymakers and expertise or media or in-kind things like a computer, a sound system, an iPhone so that they can actually get their voices heard. And they needed outspoken champions that were championing some of their ideas from their communities. So it's not really, people always talk about transfer of knowledge, but it's a two-way transfer of knowledge. And lastly, what I wanted to sort of highlight is that there are sort of very interesting coalitions that have been happening around the peace process. One of them is Time for Real Peace, in which, unfortunately, Sahar Halamzeh is not here, but it is a coalition that is driven by individuals in the diaspora who have different skill sets. So skill sets, those who know how to approach media, those who know how to influence policy, others who know how to mobilize and who have connections in Afghanistan. So it's not just simply about representation, it's about what types of capacities do you need in that coalition. And then one last thing is, one of the things that always struck me on Afghanistan is policymakers used to tell me, well, the narrative in Afghanistan is terrible. There is no narrative. Afghanistan is associated with the same idea of balkanization, of division and disunity, and that there needs to be some sort of platform that collates information, and some sort of digital platform that can collate information, that can raise the profile and the stories of both diaspora members as well as Afghan activists in a much more storytelling, less news way. And I'm lucky to have been supported at different times by one of the funders and have helped seed one of these platforms, which is actually run by Kiamar Barakzai, who is right here, and he can give, it hasn't launched, but there's a soft launch that is seeking to get in Afghan writers as a platform, but also, when the articles are of really high quality, even potentially placing them in other media outlets like the Post, the New York Times. The platform is a partnership approach, including Afghan Professionals Network, that also organizes very well along professional lines. and different other organizations. So he will be seeking both writers and partners, and it would be great for you all to speak to him.
Great. Thank you so much. Hold your thought, because I want to ask you about the Greek-American experience, just so people can have a practical map or visualization of it. But I want to go to Fareed. Can you, Fareed, tell us what is stopping the Afghan diaspora community in the UK or on the European level to create something like the Afghan European lobby group or the Afghan American lobby group that we haven't been able to establish? What are the practical reasons stopping them? Ethnic divisions, lack of capacity, their low level intellectual or even financial status in the society? What is it? And if you could be brief, please.
Thanks, Mariam. I think findings in my paper explains that first of all, Afghan diaspora in the UK is not a very cohesive, a unified platform. So it's fragmented, and Afghans do not get in touch quite often to the way that other diasporas in the UK have these sort of relationships. And then ethnicity, obviously a big issue. Quite often people from different ethnic groups link themselves to certain types of thinking, ideologies, or ethnic background in Afghanistan and beyond. This is not a big issue at the moment, because positive thinkings have been produced by many across the UK and Afghanistan. But of course, identity politics is a critical issue, recently emphasized by Francis Fukuyama, professor of Stanford University, in 2018, and the consequences in that book, if anyone wishes to read. This was the main things, but from the ground, some of the interviews in the UK is quite positive in my opinion, because I interviewed a girl, Manila Akwari, living in Harrow. She was very, very, very positive in terms of thinking about women's role. In the UK and beyond, she advised Afghan diaspora to help Afghan women and children in Afghanistan and try to help them out to come to the UK for higher education. This was the main purpose. So through education, they could get empowered in Afghanistan, and then they could reduce a lot of issues in the country. Some of the interviews back in Afghanistan that I'd like to focus. The upper house of the Deputy of Parliament in Afghanistan, Muhammad Alami Zadiyar. So he was quite in support of Afghan girls and women to be educated and to be supported through their fellow citizens from the UK, because he thought that women's education and empowerment could reduce discrimination, including sexual assault. No, not that one. Not that one. Yeah, that's it. And then the security, I think my colleague raised the issue of peace talk. The security director of the government of Afghanistan didn't really talk about the issue of security because it was too early for him. But I had a chance of interviewing one of the senior Taliban in Afghanistan, who's provided security by the government. So, if you want to bring it down, please. His name is Mullah Mujahid. He reluctantly supported education freedom and their role in the government of Afghanistan, but then within the spectrum of Sharia law. So now this is an issue that could be interpreted in different perspectives, how we define Sharia law, which I would leave it for now. And one more was advisor to the President Ghani, Professor Hamidullah Farooqi. He is the Chancellor of Kabul University also. I think he asked specifically about exporting the West to South Asia in terms of urban living and their knowledge of city living to help women and girls in Afghanistan, but then exporting such a culture in South Asia, I don't know if that's an easy task. That could also be left for further discussion.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So Marika, if you could tell us what the Greek Americans did that kind of turned them into a very successful lobby group in the US that can obviously very successfully demonstrate their ability to run their host countries, as well as benefit Greeks or the Greek diaspora around the world. What could Afghans do in Europe, in the US, in Asia, in practical terms, A, B, C, D?
Yes, and it sort of maps on a little bit to what you were saying about fragmentation before, because the Greek community, especially in the 70s, when you had this Cyprus-Turkey issue, that was a moment of mobilization for them. The Greek community is a highly divided community by island. My mom is Spartan, and she only joins the Spartan society, not the Greek society. Well, my dad, is from another island. What they did was they used a moment, again, it did rely on a few dedicated people, but they used a moment, an impetus. We have to look at what are some of the catalytic moments. The peace process is potentially one of them. They used, when the invasion of Cyprus was happening, they used that as a catalytic moment to move beyond our local identity to look into the national identity. And then what they also did is they only targeted a few key Congress members, and was one. Secondly, what they did is that even for those who they agreed on principles, not necessarily on internal politics, because that never works. Because whenever you do look at internal politics, you will always have divergence. And just as a side note, one thing I do hear from U.S. policymakers on Afghanistan and sort of the role of diaspora, even though they're not as active as they are in the UK, as well so-and-so wants so-and-so for president, and so-and-so wants so-and-so for president. And then from the American perspective, they're like, well then, we have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And, that's not, you are then, because there are also institutional rivalries within the host countries. So I think being able to come against principle, I think what also is very helpful is seeing, what are the space for action. In terms of where what are some of the most effective things you can do is the framing of debate, some of the narrative and the storytelling. 2 is acting as a resource to policymakers, being ready with very sort of fact sheets and so forth, being able to package what is already existent, let's say by Afghan civil society, but packaging that in something that's readable to the audience that you seek. And also both not only introducing legislation, but also at critical points, at least from the Greek community, and I would imagine it sometimes applies to the Afghan community, is blocking aid for rival countries. Because really it is, not that I'm suggesting that as a way forward, but that was very critical to the Greek case. And so I think, with the Afghan American community, they are actually quite well organized, but more focused on domestic issues rather than foreign policy issues, because there is a certain level of resource that is on occasion needed. When people say, oh, the National Iranian American Council, well, the Iranian Americans are a very well-funded community. However, they actually, the first 3 years of their existence had no money, and they didn't actually get money from the community. They got money from other types of activities, from foundations that aligned in principle to the fact that they didn't want a war. And that's when they were then able to mobilize community finances. So I think sometimes what I've noted when other diasporas organize, they think that they need to have some sort of funding beforehand, before taking action, and you can actually do a lot more with a lot less money, frankly.
And could you tell us, is the Greek American lobby group, is it very hierarchical, or is it a power sharing sort of arrangement between different organizations that they can work collaboratively in coalition that Afghans could perhaps do even if they are divided along the ethnic and religious and linguistic lines? But they could have an umbrella group and then work together along those lines, and also on issues rather than just to have a hierarchical structure. What is the Greek situation?
Well, I think the Greek in the past was very hierarchical. I think that is also an issue of context. I think as things have, but even at the same time, they had to bring in all the associations and all the coalitions. And they initially focused on, identifying the principles and who had the capabilities to do what activity. They also did have some decentralized decision making. And three, they also came together, not, where they differ from some of the others, they came together at moments of crises, which has made them weaker than other diaspora organizations, but still very effective because they know their numbers, and they know, and they also have a lot of, nowadays, especially where everything is about the media and communications and the ability to present information, they have a lot of people in, the professionals in the branding world who will help them. And I think that it's terrible to focus on that, but I think there is an issue always of how you present information in that host country and how you present information coming out of the home country.
And one last point, and then we'll go to some of the questions that there will be. When you look at the Afghan communities in the West or outside Afghanistan, their percentage, so to speak, in the academic sphere is very low. It's close to none, basically, because we don't have many academics, and then the ones we do have, they're not published in prestigious journals or newspapers, or they don't have that voice that other communities, such as the Indians or the Pakistanis or others may have, because English is another, thanks to the colonial legacy, some would say, Indians and Pakistanis, they're far more, I think, comfortable with that compared to the Afghan community. So that has an impact on how they can package their narrative, so to speak, into the world and into the rest of the country. So what would you recommend in that scenario, such as the Afghans? What should they do? Should they just start blogging? Everyone start blogging, telling their stories, or reaching out to people who are very well versed so they can package their message in the language of the West? I mean, it's a terrible way of saying it, but
I think there's multiple approaches. So even with, let's say, an Afghanistan Now platform or a Time for Real Peace, a lot of it was actually sourcing young writers in Afghanistan, but then taking the time to edit their material, taking the time to make it presentable. A lot of the very good mobilization work that happens in Afghanistan, often is filled with, white space on paper is important. Yeah, so it's about having that sort of branding sense, political sense, but not changing necessarily the message. You're not there to tell people what to do and what to say. You're there to, allow it to be understandable. One of the things I've always found sometimes frustrating on the Afghan side is that, which I understand the purpose, is that every time a civil society group puts out a statement, it's 3 pages. No one reads 3 pages. I'm sorry. When we speak to policymakers, they read half a page to a page.
Oh, one paragraph.
Or one paragraph. I don't know how to do infographics, but people like it. So I think that's where the young diaspora can really be involved. Actually, is acting as that conduit, as that translator, in a coalition approach, and also, one, understanding what are the main concerns in the country, and generating data, because right now there's not enough data generated on Afghanistan.
So when you say data, can you break it down? What do you mean exactly?
So generating data, so a lot of people speak in the name of the Afghan people.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, the Afghan people have so many contradictory ideas, even though everyone speaks on them as a whole. There's very little surveys that come out. You hear about all the consultations that have taken place around peace processes, yet if no one else hears about them, they don't really exist. I don't say that, I say that in a bit of a harsh way, but even let's say the Loya Jirga was a government thing, 23 points came out. It's pretty impossible to find those 23 points on the website. So when you look at other peace processes, even in places like Yemen, they have come together to create portals that you can actually, where you can actually publicize the findings and the data that is coming out that civil society is doing. And in Afghanistan, it's scattered across multiple sites. It's really hard to aggregate information.
And that's on the governmental level or the civil society level?
I think that's where the diaspora can also be helpful, is to be able to coordinate, if possible. It is on the governmental level, but it's also to a certain extent on civil society. I know, for instance, Afghan Women's Network does great work doing consultations, but whittling away what they say in one or two statements isn't, yes, you have your very concise campaign statement, but being able to then demonstrate the sort of the breadth and diversity of opinions is also very helpful, and also being able to quantify it.
And I presume that has implications for the validity of it, the legitimacy of the data, because if you are presenting something to a Western audience, they'll be like, okay, where have you taken that from? How many people you've spoken to? And if you're wishy-washy, then obviously nobody's going to believe your word. Thank you, that's fascinating, that's really good. So any questions? Yeah? So we'll take 3 and then answer them.
It's not just a question, just a bit of comment really on my observation. I think the passing the message to the mechanism that's what we're discussing about it, the mechanism that we really need to establish and how we can actually pass the message to the government. One of the areas that I'm thinking, correct me if I'm wrong, is to, you mentioned Afghan Women Network type of NGO, but also there's lots of European and American consulting companies that they already operate in Afghanistan, and they are the bridge between, and that where that we can actually use them as a mechanism to pass the message, because they are the people who are directly involved working with the government in Afghanistan, and they can actually influence the way that things needs to be changed. I think that's one of the, it's just observation.
If I could ask, why don't we do that at the moment? What do you think?
I think what it is, it's a very good question, Sandra, because what's happening in Afghanistan right now, I mean, although we do have a lot of consulting companies who are involved, like we're working through with USAID and also with a number of donors, but they can't just go individual people and find out their views. They are desperately looking for communities like that to find out what, people like, communities like people that talented people I mentioned before. So, but they can't find it. So they have to go what they have. So I think our influence in this community is going to be a great help, but using the right mechanism. So I still think there's a lot of thought needs to be done in this conference that we've discussed. I think there should be another stage of how we can shape this, and later on how we can come up with a mechanism that is needed. And I think that could be one.
Yeah, okay. Great, thanks.
Another 2 questions, number 1 and number 2.
I have some evidence that the ministries in Afghanistan under the IOM has developed some work under the diaspora, which is called Afghan National Diaspora Policy. And Farijan, I think, put some background information about it. And the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs is leading on this. However, there have been intervened in 4 countries like Norway, Australia, and the United States. However, I spoke to them and they ignored United Kingdom because our health care association is one of the biggest association in the world in regarding the Afghan capacity. So, I mean, we are not going to start from scratch. We are not going to start from scratch. Okay, this work has been done in the UK and this was done in the United States. So we have to, gather these all stakeholders with the IOM as well. For example, in George Washington University, there was a scholar called Sybil Freehold. Recently he released a paper on diaspora engagement, and she also provided the engagement model businesses. So if we join together these hands with the IOM stakeholders and then the Farid and others, so it's not a scratch work. A lot has been done. We have to build the wall. Thank you very much.
There's one last question here.
Hi, thank you very much for your contributions. It's really answered a lot of questions that I've been thinking about personally. And I'm really interested in this whole idea of lobbying and lobbying the British government. And I was wondering what kind of things should the diaspora community be asking the British government for, bearing in mind that it's been involved with an 18-year war that's unsuccessful, and this is the 4th time that Britain has been in Afghanistan. So what are the kind of things that the community should be lobbying for towards the British government? Thank you, beautiful question.
I'll just quickly try to answer them. On using consultants and USAID, defense contractors, all of those people as a mechanism, I think it's great to have them as surrogates and as allies, though there could be tactical interests that align, but not necessarily always the same interests align. So ensuring how you engage with everyone, I think is, but yes, this could be some of the biggest allies, both not only towards, even less so towards your own Afghan government, but also towards the governments that actually pay, because this is, this is American taxpayer money, so it needs to be held accountable. And so yes to it. I wouldn't put them in the lead because they don't necessarily share the same interests. On gathering all stakeholders, great to map out things. IOM, I think, has a program. I don't know IOM's programs. I both am pro working with international institutions, but also a little hesitant given their bureaucracies. But, some of the more effective campaigning is more flexible organization styles, but yes to all of that. And that's why I think, people have tried to do it. I think OSF paid for a mapping of all diaspora across Europe and the US. I don't know if that report's been made public, but really understanding what sort of assets you already have in place and where the gaps are in being able to execute the strategy is necessary. On the British government and unsuccessful, I think one is demanding transparency. Frankly, this entire peace process has lacked transparency from the beginning and is engendering a lot of fear and sort of hedging in the country and also within the diaspora. We see tweets all the time about process telling us nothing on what will be negotiated and what will not. We've heard stuff like nothing's negotiated to all's negotiated, though I heard yesterday that's no longer the case. So I think demanding transparency from your government as to what is actually going on. I think inclusion matters, but inclusion can often be used as a fig leaf to co-opt groups. We saw that happening with some of the women's stuff. I think secondly, understanding whether or not there is some sort of, asking on what are the development priorities. Will in the event of a peace agreement, one that may not necessarily match UK values, are they going to continue, to get an honest answer, because people need to understand in negotiating peace, because even the Taliban are expecting aid to come into the country, but really getting an understanding, is that aid forthcoming, or are we all just, participating in a charade? And then 3, to take seriously, I think having some sort of, to take seriously, the involvement of the non-political types, like having some more civic actors and so forth, like pushing sort of the inclusion, not just inclusion, but the interests of those who don't seek political careers. But I would really focus on the transparency issue, and also, lastly, and this is linked to transparency that I just forgot, I think it's forgot, yeah.
Everyone has to appreciate that previously the Western thought was that individual freedom is precious than peace. But apparently the position of the West, especially the United States, is that peace has priorities over election. So we are in a very critical situation, to be honest, and we do appreciate the Britain's role, especially through the representative in NATO, civilian representative from NATO in Afghanistan from the UK, that tireless working for equality and social justice and effective political institutions and everything. But then we have to wait what's going to happen in the future, because apparently the situation is very uncertain and it is undefinable.
Great. Do we have more questions, or do we not have time?
Just one question.
Okay.
Oh, just the one. Sorry, but yeah, just because we're running for a break, but we can ask them later if that's okay. My lovely assistant.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask either Sana or Rika, are there processes in place either by the international community or the Afghan state itself to sustain itself, assuming that the peace process with the Taliban goes through? Are there any processes for the state structures to remain in place? Because one of the things that a lot of people wonder, what if the Taliban try to break the state down, as in they don't give much legitimacy to the current government at the moment, so what will it be like once there is a US withdrawal in there? Are there any backup plans for the state to remain intact?
Do you want to go ahead? Well, I think that's an area the diaspora could advocate for. I think this sort of false dichotomy between peace and elections that has now come up has threatened the state structure. I think we need to also make distinctions between state and government. State being we can all get behind an effective state, and so that we don't have to talk about who like in government. We still don't know, frankly, and you can tell who agrees where. You can see that the Americans are less concerned about elections and more concerned about withdrawal. And you can see that the Europeans are very concerned. They link democratic processes to sustainable peace. So I think the diaspora can get involved here. This is, around, preserving some of the gains that have been made, even with, even with changes, because, changes are always welcome, to be able to bring people on board, but should they be done within a constitutional process, or should they be done at a table, a small table of mainly men?
We have one more, do we?
Just one more question.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
please.
Sorry, I forgot earlier.
Well, basically, it's a kind of comments rather than a question. So, I think there was an earlier discussions made on with regards to engaging the international community like the United Kingdom or others through aid or through other sorts of kind of engagement. So, I just would like to clarify that the narrative in the West has changed. So there is no state building. Human rights, women's rights, all these sorts of things are just slogans. So these are not something that the US now, particularly with the Trump that has come there, that makes basically no sense. The only kind of interest that Afghanistan, whether it's diaspora or whoever else, could get engaged with the West, and particularly the United Kingdom, is basically through other bilateral sort of agreements within, because the insurgency and the insurgency with these peace talks that is going on, President Trump just would like to have some sort of credit so that he can show to the people of America and his taxpayers that we are doing something in Afghanistan. So if you look at the figures, if I put some statistics, US and then I'm sure that the other Western partners with Afghanistan are tired of paying a lot of money there. So army or coercive power in Afghanistan is going to cost us $6 billion. So again, those sort of diaspora values, again, democracy, human rights, to me looks like myth. For them, it is important how much they fuel the economy in Afghanistan. And that's a huge amount of money, $6 billion. Afghanistan's budget, Afghanistan domestic resources only barely makes like $2 billion. But you have got $6 billion. And unfortunately, I have a very pessimistic picture. I'm sorry but you guys also share a kind of very optimistic picture. So we are at the verge of collapse, to be honest, if things are not moving very well. And there's a lot of uncertainty going on at the global arena picture. Look at the Brexit. Brexit is so much engaged with its own affairs. The UK is too much into that. So why would Afghanistan would matter for them? Look at the Trump and look at the Trump's policy. The picture of the US and also the crisis of Syria, Middle East. These are all kind of problems that kind of makes our shared interest to be detached. That was just the kind of concern.
Thank you. I just want to make a really quick comment. One is on the figures. First of all, we also know that the DoD inflates its figures, and a lot of the money that goes towards the Afghanistan budget is actually recirculated into DoD budget. So back onto data, being able to understand how much money is actually staying in Afghanistan and contributing to its economic development would be helpful rather than being rerouted into our own countries. So, I mean, 60% of most funding comes right back into the United States. So there are economic incentives, back to your point on the defense contractors, who might be able to be tactically helpful. On the issue of human rights, it's not about painting a positive picture, because you will have advocates. You will need to deal with the security argument. You will have to always be able to talk about US national interests, UK national interests, but they can align with Afghan national interests. On the human rights issues, people may not care as much about human rights, but there are people, also these are not, in the US, you still have to deal with Congress. You still have people in Congress who care about human rights issues, who can block legislation, who block things. And if you looked at what happened in February, when the women rose and said, it was a disaster for the U.S. Special Envoy, and it ended up stopping them, because then they had to actually talk to Congress. They had just passed the Women, Peace and Security Act in the U.S. that made it a requirement that women were at the table. It slowed down the process, allowing people to start thinking through. So I agree that it's a very difficult time, but you make the alliances you can. And there are, these are all democratic countries that have different interest groups, and different interest groups can be aligned in different ways. I mean, even now, the last week, if you've been following the Washington Post or the New York Times, it's been one article against another person. It is a war in the United States on what is happening in Afghanistan too, at least in the halls of Washington. So there's always entry points.
I think, Dr. Sarajdeen, I believe if you study the foreign policy of the US throughout the years and centuries probably, they more rely on human rights, democracy, free market, and elections. So I don't think if the US would take that huge risk even under Trump administration. And of course, Trump is very complicated. He talks very contradictory. So recently, Ambassador Voss in Afghanistan said that we will support Afghanistan and its army, even after peace talk. So we've got great support from NATO allies, as you mentioned. So they are in line in Afghanistan republic system. So I don't think that we are on the verge of collapse. So hopefully that will not happen.
One last point, there is an article about the spending, how much money the US spent in Afghanistan from the BBC's reality check team. If you want to check it out, they have done, so the team came about after fake news and all that. So what they do, they take facts and separate it from fiction. So if you really are interested in that kind of hardcore data stuff, then check out the BBC's reality team. Another thing I want to say is that we are not optimists but realists, I would say. I mean, personally speaking for myself, because priorities change, and I think as diaspora we should adjust our own expectations and the expectations of others. So there won't be Trump, but there will be Congress, there will be the values that we all share, the same in the UK and the same in other parts of the world. So I think our responsibility is to just adjust our expectations and meet people halfway. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Very insightful panel. Definitely got the emotions flowing. To continue on with that, we can all agree, I think, there are tough times ahead, but resiliency, strength and collaboration, that's who we are, right? That's what makes Afghans Afghans.